You're very welcome to today's Advocacy Exchange. As we are getting more people joining us, just to offer context for how we'll spend our time together today. We're really here for two things, as you know, of course, from the session description. First, a conversation about the role of technology, personal stories, and improved patient care, a very powerful mix for the future of advocacy. And second, to collaborate in our working groups as we collectively build the future of advocacy within these teams. As people are joining us, though, first, let's check in for a minute. A question for you then. Love to see in the chat, if you don't mind sharing, what's going well? To focus a little bit on our session today and build from Dave Bjork's sharing about Lung Cancer Awareness Month, we also, just to recognize some of the work going on this team, we have in the United States National Diabetes Month, as well as later this month on the 14th, World Diabetes Day. And so massive stretches of time for those of you working in that space. Additionally, it's National Family Caregivers Month in the States. And so hats off to you and big praise to all of you who are doing that caregiving and very local advocacy work for your loved ones. Additionally, in the US, it's Native American Heritage Month, so a chance when we get to share and appreciate all of those members of Native American groups. Our big focus today, of course, as you know, is this work, is this thinking on the role of technology and personal narratives and how that promotes well-being. And so to get to the first part of our meeting together and time together today, I will jump into this conversation, as you will see, with Paul von Autenried and Melodie Narain-Blackwell, where we have the chance to dig into the ways that technology and sharing and personal connection can make such a profound difference in not only the kinds of technologies we have access to for treatment, but the ways we go about building community and building connection. As you are watching these interviews, just as a reminder for a quick change on Zoom, we will ask, just for the sake of convenience in your own view, you will likely want to turn your camera off. And once we change to the interview format in the upper right, you'll be able to click on a standard view, which will prioritize the conversation so that you can attend to it as best as possible. So with that said, now to my conversation with Paul and Melodie, and when it's over, I will check back in and we will go into our working groups. Talk to you soon. We are very fortunate to be joined today by our two guests, Paul von Autenried of Bristol Myers Squibb and Melodie Narain-Blackwell, founder of Color of Crohn's and Chronic Illness, among other things, as we'll hear about in a few minutes. They have each spent their careers working on issues of access, a key theme for us here at the Advocacy Exchange, as our working groups seek more equitable, advocate-driven care with access as a foundational element to everything we do. Because without access, there is no progress. To begin, I'll ask each panelist for a brief introduction before we invest in some conversation about their careers and experiences working on issues of access. Paul, could I ask you to introduce yourself and offer some more information to set the stage for the day?
Sure, Brad, happy to. Thanks so much for the opportunity. My education is as an engineer, but the last 40 years, my professional career in life has been really devoted to a very common theme, which is trying to leverage the latest in digital technology to fundamentally change the human condition and the world. And most recently, the last 25 years, I've done this in the role of head of IT, the information technology team at Bristol Myers Squibb. And there's never been a better moment to really be an IT professional in the life sciences industry, because of the degree to which healthcare and life sciences is more importantly starting to rely upon information science in addition to biological and chemistry. But I come to this conversation wearing two other hats that may be of interest to our discourse. The other hat I wear here at BMS is I'm the sponsor of one of our people and business resource groups. the Pan-Asian Network in this case. And that group focuses quite a bit on trying to address health disparities and access issues for different communities around the world. So I can comment on that. And there's a third hat that I'm wearing, and that is I'm also a patient with a chronic condition, type 1 diabetes. And I am sort of living proof that technology combined with innovative medicines can be a game changer in one's healthcare outcomes. So I look forward to talking about that a bit also.
Thank you very much, both for that work and for sharing it with us. That, as we're going to hear, brings some impactful insights to this topic. Melodie, could I ask you to introduce yourself for a few minutes, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here, Brad. And nice to get acquainted with you, Paul. My name is Melodie Narain-Blackwell, and Advocacy chose me. I did not choose this space. It came knocking on the door, and I kind of reluctantly opened it. And here I am today as the founder of Color of Crohn's and Chronic Illness, and I'm a patient. I'm a patient with Crohn's disease, and it's interesting because my world and my education is in fashion and entrepreneurship. And that was the avenue that I was working in. And I was working with other entrepreneurs and business development and kind of leading in that space. And I had been suffering for years, since I was probably 6 or 7 years old, with stomach aches that would be debilitating. And I wasn't diagnosed until I was about 35 or 36 years old. So from 6 or 7 years old up until in my mid 30s, I had a chronic illness that I wasn't aware of. I had Crohn's disease, and what my family knew and what they thought was management of it with ginger ale, crackers, and rest. It wasn't a management for a disease. And we just always knew that I had stomach issues. And that's how we categorize this. Oh, she's having stomach issues. I remember recently talking to an ex-boyfriend, and I said, remember when I used to have those stomach aches? And he was like, yes, and you have to rub your stomach in a circular motion. And so I had come up with these own management concepts for me in this stomach issue, because I was told things like I have IBS, or I just have internal hemorrhoids from the bleeding. And I just, it was something I ate, and it was always placed on me for the reasons why this was occurring for my stomach issues, never connecting me to the fact that there could be an issue. And after I had my son, I had a bridal shop at that time, and I was running my business, and I was an event planner, and I had him, and I dealt with massive amounts of swelling, like the Nutty Professor. I would literally be having a conversation with someone, and my bottom lip would start to swell up, and it would go down to my chin. And I would sit there and I'm talking, and I'd see their face, just like Paul is making. And I'd say, oh, it's the lip thing. And they're like, so this was a consistent method of telling me there's something wrong with my body. I would go to the hospital. They would ask me if I have an allergy. I would tell them no. And they would say, oh, she has an allergy. Then they would give me Benadryl, and I would wake up after a nice sleep, and they say, you don't have an allergy. There's something going on with you. Thank you, Sherlock. And that was the recurring theme in my life. I would go to the hospital. They'd say I'd have an allergy. They'd give me this Benadryl. Then they give me some kind of steroid, and it would just start all over. I went to doctor after doctor. One doctor told me just to continue to squeeze my lip. My mom was so concerned that she said, she would ask me every morning, did you squeeze your lip today? And I would say, this lady is losing her mind if she really thinks that this is what's going to cure whatever's occurring with me. And I then went into eating all organically, and I started having a lot of random feet swelling now, knee swelling. I had 64 ounces of fluid removed from my knee. And all of a sudden, just I would say the Crohn's was on steroids, because it literally beefed itself up. I bled for 4 months. I went to nonstop. I had dealt with these intermittent bleeding spells throughout my 20 plus years of this. But I went to a physician. I told him I thought I had cancer. I told him everything that was wrong with me. I've been bleeding for 4 months. It doesn't stop. He said he didn't see anything. And I said, wow, I gauze in my colon every day because the bleeding doesn't stop. And from there, I started getting abscesses that were recurring. And finally, after an emergency surgery from a burst of a golf ball sized abscess, I was on my path to finally being diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And that I shared my story because as an entrepreneur, I was already talking about health because I know that in my community, we shelve it as women first. And then culturally, access. It's an access issue. It's a literacy issue. We don't want to go into spaces that we're not comfortable. So we back away from them and we manage what we can manage. And I didn't want to be a victim of that. And I felt like it would be easy to fall in that. My father's Indian and my mother's Black. So it's easy to, as a diverse person from diverse communities, fall in that space of shelving the health. And I said, I'm not going to be a victim to that. And I'm not going to let the community that I serve become victim to that. So I talked about it a lot. Once I actually got diagnosed and I shared that, I was flooded with messages. People telling me they were just diagnosed in the 90s with IBD and they were the first Black person. People asking me, can I talk to their cousin, their aunts, what the doctors were saying to them. And they were just sharing all these stories. And I was trying to manage it just in DM. And I said, oh my goodness, at this time, I now owned the bridal shop and a restaurant. And I was a mom and a wife, and like all of these things were just piling up. And I said, okay, let me make a Facebook group and everybody can kumbaya and they'll love each other. They'll have community because they were right in what they were sharing with me. I did the research. I saw that there were no communities of color talking about IBD. There was no support from other larger entities for communities of color with IBD. And I said, okay, let's just shift it over here. People can become friends and they'll find each other. After I was made aware of the similarities to the stories, the access issues, the literacy issues, the reckless disregard, the lack of education. I mean, the list just kept going on and on and on. I said, who am I going to pass this to? Like, who's going to do it? I can't do it. Who's going to do it? And I didn't have a choice. So when I say that advocacy found me, it literally said, hey, you went through all this, you lost your hair, you had recurring eye infections, you lost 30 pounds in 5 weeks, you stopped walking, you had 8 fistula, drains in your colon. I mean, the list goes on and on. That was for purpose. Now go ahead, I'm providing. And literally that's where I am today, walking in purpose, provision, and providing an opportunity for people to get wellness.
Wow, Melodie, my word. I'm so sorry to hear that's your experience, but we sit in awe of what you make of it.
You know, we have to take the lemons and make lemonade. Who doesn't love lemonade?
For sure. We do the best we can. Could I ask you to expand a little bit and share on that work that you're doing
Sure.
in the literacy space? Because
Sure.
as you say, it's so hard oftentimes for providers to make connections or for people, particularly those from historically marginalized groups, to be heard. And you're doing a lot of work to help others be heard and work on these health literacy issues.
Absolutely.
Could you describe what that work looks like for us so that our advocates in the audience can
Sure.
borrow some best practices?
Sure. With IBD, I feel like the first point of literacy is acknowledgement and validation. And that's a huge missing component. Most of the community members that we have over 500 members, it took them at least 15 years to get diagnosed. And that should not be the track record for this. That's tough. So with physicians and providers, the thing that I think is the huge point of entry for patients, it's stop telling people that Black and brown people don't get these diseases. Stop qualifying it as an ethnicity or a cultural disease, but hey, you have this disease by these measurements, these standards. Because if you're testing for the overall measurements and standards and triggers, then you'll know that this is a qualifier. It doesn't matter if they're Indian, Asian, Black, Hispanic, those things don't matter. It's what the markers are indicating. And a lot of people of color, they weren't even qualified to be tested for those markers and indicators. So that's, to me, there's the literacy side on the provider's part, like stop saying that, because now you disqualify them and you're removing a lens for a community who has no even awareness of this, because none of the materials convey that this is a disease that could be attached to these communities. And none of the materials are even written to communicate to these communities. So like when you remove that already from educators, med school, from physicians that are practicing to the patient who cannot teach themselves about something that they have no awareness of, you remove the opportunity to even be literate. It's just moved.
Absolutely. Yeah, to think about these as so foundational, including how medical education happens and outreach, but to empower people to continue to
Yes.
assert for themselves, to be
Yes.
heard, is such an essential message to share.
Absolutely. And you have people like Paul who are creating these technology advances for communities like us, patients in general, but we don't even know to search for them because we don't know that we need them. So that now puts Paul in a different space because he has to say, okay, how does this really target or meet the need for access to this community who now doesn't even know that this is on their radar, that they have the ability to utilize this for self-management or for gain in their disease, so to speak.
Right, right. With that, Paul, could we turn it over to you? Because as you said in your introduction, you come at this issue of access from multiple angles and the most powerful kinds of complexity. Could I ask you to describe how you've invested yourself in access issues over the years? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, thanks very much. Maybe as a foundational remark, I would say that I do believe that technology is fundamentally changing not just the way drugs are discovered and developed and delivered to patients, but it is changing the way patients access and experience those innovative treatments, including innovative medicines. Now, at Bristol Myers Squibb, we're approaching this problem from multiple lenses because it's a multifaceted problem and there isn't sort of one simple solution. But I'm going to comment on two here. One is that we've always, as a company, understood our need to help address health disparities and healthcare disparities all around the world. And there's a geographic component to that, but there's also an ethnic component to that access question. So one of the ways we're trying to address that better as a company is we've put together these people and business resource groups, which bring sort of shared passion, birds of a feather sort of groups within our employee base together to help us as a company solve these problems. I'm the sponsor of one of those people and business resource groups called the Pan Asia Network. And that group, like the other PBRGs, are doing amazing things in helping our team understand how do you gain access to those communities? What are the obstacles to important messaging, important access to clinical trials, important access to the medicines themselves through different channels and forums. So these PBRGs have been very, very powerful to us as a company to make us better at understanding the underlying obstacles and beginning to address them. We have, for example, over the summer, together with the Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation, announced a number of initiatives that are focused on this. And one that I would mention in particular is our commitment to increase the number of clinical trials that we have going on and locate 25% of all of our trial research sites in intentionally highly diverse communities by 2022. So that would be one of many, many ideas that has emerged from the work that we've done on this topic together with PBRGs. There's one other group that I wanted to mention, and that's our peer program. It's the Patient Expert Engagement Resource Program. This is also part of our values and our commitments to contribute back to the communities in which we live and work. And when we talk about transforming the lives of patients, we mean transforming the lives of all patients wherever they are. And so the peer team deals with advocacy stakeholders. In fact, helps us sponsor events like this one to provide voice and perspectives on how you could discover and develop medicines and deliver them even differently when you look at them through the lens of the unique healthcare disparity issues that these groups address. In May of 2020, when we launched the peer group, since then we've had 63 expert advocates already doing a variety of things, from reviewing our clinical trial protocols, making protocols themselves easier for people to comply with, providing better communication and summaries, and dealing more with health economics and research, outcomes research. I'll close it there.
I appreciate that. That internal advocacy is so consequential because those existing professional relationships can really help people who are already on the team kind of steer the ship in more equitable, inclusive ways. And so that is a wonderful starting point. Building on that, both of you, again, obviously have lots of experience working on advocacy issues, and our audience today are people who are themselves invested every day in issues of advocacy. Some are at the very beginning of their journeys, some are world leaders in advocacy. But I'm curious, based on your own experiences, what advice you would give advocates to help with their own effectiveness. What are some best practices or principles or kind of personal guidelines that you've learned in your own efforts? Melodie, if I could start with you.
I didn't really understand what it meant to be an advocate when I started this journey. And that's just the truth. I think transparency and honesty is the foundation of where you start with this, right? And I didn't know what that meant. And I disqualified myself. That's why when I say I reluctantly opened the door to this, I said, this is not me. I don't do this. I'm an entrepreneur. I build business. This is nonprofit. Like, where's the money? And what am I building? What am I doing? So I was challenged because I was going into uncharted territory for me. And I learned what that meant. And I learned that I had been doing it. And I think it takes a lot of introspection, because we're advocating for ourselves every single day. And if a person is walking in this space, the best thing that I know to do is look at the policies, look at the challenges, look at the presentations of what people are going through and yourself, and say, how would this impact me? How would this impact my loved ones? How would I feel if this happened? And what would I do about it? And that is how I charged myself to take on the advocacy endeavors that we stand on at COCCI, whether it's for access, whether it's copay accumulators, whether it's step therapy. You know, I think about me, if I was in this position, because my position isn't like all of the community members that I serve, but if I was to be in that position, especially knowing the levels of debilitating challenges I face with my disease, I would fight like this. I would say this. And that has even helped us and equipped us with the ability to give guides to our community members. When you're at the doctor and you're going to see a provider, ask these questions. If they say this, you can ask this. If they tell you this, you can ask this. And it's giving us a lot of power to lead them to better outcomes, because they're now equipped to ask qualifying questions, or questions that lead the conversation in a way that makes them comfortable.
Right. I appreciate that. And I want to come back to it in 1 second, because I think there's a lot of power in what you just said, especially as we think about November being National Family Caregivers Month. The more we can empower people to advocate on behalf of their loved ones, that's a very consequential aspect of advocacy at a very personal level.
Yes. And a lot of people, they don't know what to ask. They don't know what is okay, what isn't okay. Can I say that? Can I change my physician? Do I have to stay there? This doctor said this to me. Is this okay? They don't know, because they're really in a space of fear, anxiety, unawareness. So that puts another lens of, I'm just going to listen and do what they say. And that's not patient-centered. And this is not what we're striving for. We're not striving for care to be placed onto someone as if they're in a box. And this is another value that Paul's endeavor brings to this, because we're talking about things like precision medicine and medicine that is focused on the particular patient. You can't do that when you don't even know how to be a part of the conversation. You have to be, as a care partner and a patient, a part of this conversation. It's your conversation.
Agreed. And that additional work can be so challenging and so heavy. So those guides are acutely important, and we're going to follow up on that 1 second. But to keep with the current theme, Paul, could I ask you to share a little bit about the best practices that our advocates who are in the audience today could take forward?
Yeah, the very first story that came to mind, Brad, was when I was diagnosed at age 25 with type 1 diabetes. At the time, really viewed as it's an incurable, lifelong disease, but also type 1 diabetes, even to this day, is sort of the number one cause of blindness and oftentimes heart and cardiovascular issues, as well as amputations. I'll never forget the words of my physician at the time, bedside. He said, "Paul, very quickly, you will know more about this disease than I do. And very simply, that's because you have it and I don't." And while, one might cringe perhaps at his timing and his bedside manner, he was very prescient in that remark. And so, first of all, I've invested myself deeply in trying to make sure that I make his words true. And so I researched the disease a tremendous amount. I'm thoughtful about even the physicians that I surround myself with. I actually interview them and try to find out if they're willing to work with me on a consultancy basis or sort of a more of a dictatorial basis, because I'm bringing a lot of data to my sessions. I have a lot of analytical tools that help diagnose my current condition, what my blood glucose level control levels have been, insulin regimes, and so on. And so I think part of the advocacy journey is recognizing that the patient has it, and oftentimes the doctor doesn't. And so they're using their best education and the best research to provide the best advice. But quite frankly, it's advice. And ultimately, patients have to be the adjudicator of how they interpret that advice for their own health situation. I've also never wanted to be known as Paul, the guy with diabetes, and so I haven't always led with my chronic condition. But I must say that I think a key role in advocacy is being proud and sharing your story, the degree to which you've been able to prevail against the disease, sharing your story with others, because experience matters. Experience matters a lot. And as a person who's now had it for 35 years, if I can share the lessons learned over those 35 years with somebody who's just been recently diagnosed or with their caregivers, you're giving them a gift. And I get a great deal of satisfaction in doing that. I think it's very important for all patients, especially those with chronic conditions.
Goodness, yes. I want to make some space, Melodie, if you'd like to follow up on that, because I think many of those themes that Paul just shared are things that underlie your work, and you in many ways lead the world in empowering other people to do.
Absolutely. No, when Paul said sharing the stories and understanding that it's just advice, these are things that we tell our community all the time, that yes, this is the provider, but you know yourself better than anyone else. And this is why it's important to write down your symptoms, to kind of journal it so that you can have a track record of this. And we're developing something called HuHub, which is Health Unity Equity. It's an app that speaks to the patient if they have forgotten to write down their symptoms, if they have had symptoms for 3 or more days. And it says, hey, Paul, I noticed you've had a stomach ache for 3 days. You want to call Dr. Ben? You want to call, Dr. Brad? It says that to you because a lot of times as patients, we are not patient. We are tired of the journey. We get complacent. We become know-it-alls, like, oh, I've managed this before. I know what's going to happen. I'll just do this way. And the body may saying, not this time. I need you to pay more attention to this. And we don't, because we're just tired. And hearing him say, share your stories. Like I may not lead with, hi, I'm Melodie, I have IBD, or I have IBD, I'm Melodie. That's not always how the conversation rolls out. And that has done a disservice to the industry, because especially in IBD, if you go and you look through social media on any of the platforms and you're looking for IBD or Crohn's or ulcerative colitis more specifically, You don't see people of color. It's very rare. It's every 100, 200, 300 photos. And that only adds to the narrative that these communities don't have the disease. So now with COCCI, we're so bold and we're loud about it. And, you know, we are sharing and we're dancing and we just had our first equity and IBD patient symposium, the first one ever in all the years of this disease catered to communities of color. And we had dancers, we had an artist. It was very culturally competent. And the community members that got to attend, all they kept saying was, I never knew anything like this existed. And I'm saying to them, it didn't. This is it existing because you decided to be bold and you decided to say, I need more. And so we created the space because you showed that it was necessary to be bold, to give you more and to meet your needs, so that it invited you to feel a part of this disease, not as a person who's suffering, but as a person who's overcoming, who's excelling, who's thriving with this disease. And a lot of the community members who have had this disease, they didn't know what thriving looked like. They were just trying to survive, to make it day to day. And in sharing stories like Paul, you see somebody with diabetes who's well and he's living and thriving. It changes where you start to think that you can go. And mental, especially with these diseases, it heavily affects the outcome. So if your mental isn't in the space to manage what's happening physically, you will cause yourself to decline more rapidly than anything else would.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Goodness, that's something so powerful to think about. But as you each have shared, the way that we can encourage others to use their voices and, you know, including for themselves, and to begin to make this wonderful point, as each of you shared. I love this quote that both of you came around on. It's just advice. It's just advice. You get to manage things. And I think if we could come back in 1 second, Melodie, I think if we look at the way you're using technology to spread that message, it's certainly really powerful. And similarly, on that theme of technology, Paul, in other ways, we have definitely seen the impact that technology has made in treatment and the ability to empower others. And so I'm curious, Paul, about how you see the role of technology in building advocacy and what the opportunities are here.
Yeah, again, I look at this, my answer to that question sort of with multiple hats, but let me start with the diabetes story. You know, 35 years ago, this was a barely manageable disease with, urine tests and multiple times a day and insulin injections. The insulin itself hasn't changed that much. We're very fortunate that it was invented many years ago, and it's recombinant DNA. It's a very strong medicine. But the revolution in the care of the disease came along with the miniaturization of glucose sensors and Bluetooth and algorithms and insulin pumps that actually continuously drip the right amount of insulin and vary it throughout the day depending on your meals and your exercise and your stress levels. So, I'm sort of living proof and also firsthand would say that technology combined with innovative medicines is transforming the care of many, many diseases. Now, I say that, though, it's well beyond, the dimension of my own personal experience with type 1 diabetes. In fact, if there is one small but significant silver lining in the cloud of the global pandemic, we have seen that remote care is much more feasible than people would have thought 2 years ago. And we're seeing a lot of healthcare system innovation that is allowing patients and their caregivers in more real-time ways gain access to the health advice and care knowledge that they need. Also, the quality of websites with good healthcare advice. Also, the ability of patients to find each other, particularly in the case of rare diseases that are perhaps continue to be significant unmet medical challenges. The ability of those patients to find each other and begin to share stories and help each other has also robustly expanded. So these are all really cool examples of technology changing healthcare and health outcomes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the idea and the ways that, as you say, it helps advocates do more in their spaces because they get to meet each other, because they have better control over their own conditions as the technology improves. And as you say, the continuous monitoring, for example, in the diabetes space, and the way that helps people assert their independence and have agency.
Right. Also, these technologies generate a lot of data. And as Melodie said, multiple times, having the data and bringing that to your caregivers and to your physicians is a very big step forward from just relying upon your recollection and a series of anecdotal experiences. I do think that data-driven decisions are generally better decisions, and I believe that caregivers and physicians are going to be able to provide much better care and much better advice if it's informed by the kind of data that a lot of the instrumentation and tools and apps that we have today are able to provide patients.
Absolutely. We're on the cusp of a very fortunate advocate-driven era in this way. To follow up on this as our final prompt, Melodie, if I could ask you to expand on that a little bit, because when we look at the way that COCCI is using digital resources, using the technology of the internet and peer-to-peer communication and those kinds of groups, there's a lot that you're doing that could be a model for other spaces. And so I was wondering if I could ask you to describe your experiences with this space and technology.
So I think technology is great, of course, right? We all do. It's how I've been able to develop and grow COCCI. The challenge with that, though, is that you can bring this technology, but if there's no understanding for how it works. One of the things that we do with COCCI is we explain a lot. We share a lot. We give them reasons why we're doing things, because the disparity in trial and research is huge. And this is one of the reasons why, like in IBD, there's not a lot of data on what works for Black and Brown communities. Does this drug work? There's this drug, there's that drug, all these drugs, because there hasn't been a concerted effort to bring the communities in, coupled with the fact of the reluctancy of the communities as well. So you have one side saying, oh, they're not going to want to do it. And you have the other side saying, what are they trying to do to me? So it just keeps making this bridge huge, wider. The gap just gets bigger and bigger. So we give them opportunities to participate in our data and our research, letting them know why we're creating these opportunities, what it will do. And I always stand on the principle when I'm talking to them about using technology and infusing it into their care, why it's important, as Paul mentioned, like telemedicine and what it can do for you. While it may not be your colonoscopy today, we don't know what it's going to be in 5 years. We don't know. And I always shift the conversation from negative to disqualifying language to affirming, uplifting language. And one of the messages I stand on, as you know, Brad, is that we're doing the work today as the present to create opportunities for the future so that they don't have to relive the inequities of the past. So if we don't do it now, there will never be a shift. There will never be an uptick, mobility for us and the whole IBD community. Because when there are not opportunities for diversity in research, data, and trials, then we are harming medicine as a whole. So infusing the data points, like Paul has said, this gives us better, there's already going to be trial and error. There's going to be room for error because we're human. But these opportunities to make it automated gives the physicians a better opportunity to provide for you. It gives the engineers better opportunities to say, hey, let's improve this because we keep noticing this with this particular device. It's triggering this. Let's improve. But we don't give ourselves the space to be included. We have to shift that. And COCCI does the work with that. And I think part of that is because we make everything a celebration. Hey, we're going to do this. We're going to get injected. We're going to try this medicine. Everything is a party because our communities like to party. So we have to do that, and we make it celebratory because it is something to be celebrated. There was a time that we couldn't do this. There was a time that COCCI wasn't here for this. So when you shift that mindset, it makes people want to gravitate to what's new, what's trending, and what feels like a place that supports you. You know, the foundation of where it comes from is a key to it as well. I'm not going to go to somewhere where that I felt historically marginalized, where I felt disregarded or disqualified, or a physician that looks like the one who may have caused trauma for me. So all of those are really key to increasing the measurements that we're trying to attain.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Both of you are making these powerful points about the way that technology and the way that advocacy work using it helps change where the agency lies, in the sense of the way that patients, their caregivers, communities as a whole get to be more involved in decision making as more and more listening happens and get to determine their own directions.
I have to say, though, Brad, I'm a huge fan of diabetes. I know that sounds crazy, but just watching the shift, seeing that young adults and children, they don't have to be connected to injections. That's a huge point of fear and anxiety. And I have a family member with diabetes, and I've seen him fall out like in mid-sentence and just collapse on the floor. That's a point of anxiety for me. So to know that they can wear these devices and all of the innovation that's in that disease space, it's always so exciting. And I feel grateful to witness that. And I'm happy to have you here sharing that, Paul, because I am a huge fan of that space and all that's being done to shift this, because children have a harder time when they're diagnosed as children managing a disease, because at some point they reject it mentally because they want to be normal. They don't want to be tied to have to manage this and not be able to do what they feel kids should be able to do.
Yeah, Melodie, I appreciate those comments. Besides the advancements in the disease that I happen to have, giving me encouragement, my optimism is that those advancements are very relevant to so many other diseases, even diseases as complex as the brain, and neuroscience conditions. I think there's enormous room for technology, wearable technology, apps on our phones, devices in our home. There's an enormous room for innovation there to fundamentally change earlier diagnosis, better treatment, and ultimately better health outcomes for patients. So it's a personal story on the diabetes, but its relevance is across so many diseases.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And I really appreciate those last 2 points by you both, because that bolsters exactly what we're doing here at the Advocacy Exchange. Why we need to learn from each other, why this whole endeavor needs to be cross-disease, cross-cultural, global, because there are best practices we can borrow and support we can offer to each other from all over the place. So with that, I thank you both immensely for being here today and sharing your experiences and your wisdom on behalf of everybody at the Advocacy Exchange. And we appreciate the opportunity to be with you and learn from you and applaud the access to care work that you continue to do.
Brad, it was a pleasure to have this discussion with you and Melodie. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much for having me. Wonderful to connect with you, Paul. I'm going to be keeping my eye on you.
and I the same, Melodie. Best wishes for your COCCI journey.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both immensely.